Well, it is Baylor week for the Sooners, which means it is also Drake Toll week. Drake does a fantastic job covering the Baylor Bears and has for the last several years. He is the dynamic host of Locked On Baylor, the most hated podcast on the campus of Texas Christian University. I realize as that those words come out of my mouth, I'm not supposed to call it Texas Christian
Not
University
anymore.
anymore. They prefer TCU and only TCU. So the most hated podcast on the campus of TCU. Drake Toll of Locked On Baylor joins us to preview the game between the Sooners and the Bears this weekend up in Norman. And Drake, we got to start with the guy that's been a revelation for the Bears as a true freshman, Richard Reese at the running back position, over 800 rushing yards on the year, 12 rushing touchdowns. How big has he been for Baylor's offense as a whole, just in terms of their functionality week to week and being able to establish the tempo and the flow of the game?
I like to consider myself a Baylor expert. If that makes me narcissist, I'm sorry. But coming into the season, we did program after program of who's going to be that guy. The Baylor freshman steps up and is a difference maker day one. Kyan Roberts Day or Alfonso Allen, and those guys at the top of the list. The one guy that was never mentioned was Richard Reese. And now he's the most electric freshman running back in the Big 12 and looks to be the future of the Big 12 running back game because he puts on 20 pounds this offseason and next year is going to be a beast. But 800 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns already. He is in line, without a doubt, to be the best freshman running back in Baylor football history, which, mind you, is not the most not the best history, by the way, but still says a lot about what he's done to jolt this offense. Now, the big problem for Baylor is that behind Richard Reese, there's just not much. He was a fourth string running back really coming into the year and became the guy, but behind him, everybody's hurt or at least dinged up to the point where they're not 100% or really even close to it. So as good as Richard Reese has been, there's not any relief. Now, linebacker Dylan Doyle is getting carries. Backup quarterback Kyron Drones is getting carries. Blake Shapen's getting more carries because Richard Reese is just it. As good as he's been, you kind of need more than one running back, and that may be an issue come Saturday for Baylor.
Well, Baylor, I'm hard pressed to say they've struggled with running back depth in years past because it seems as though they've always found a solution. Obviously, Abram Smith wasn't a natural running back and ended up being a very productive guy for the Bears for several years there. But obviously, Reese is the bread and butter of the ground attack for Baylor. But Blake Shapen, this was a guy that Dave Aranda was willing to usher Gary Bohannon into the portal for this past spring. Shapen was the guy heading into this season at the quarterback position for Baylor. What do you think of his play thus far, and what does he need to do Saturday to put the Bears in position to win a football game?
Yeah, Blake Shapen, 1,800 yards this season, 13 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. And I think what I circle is that 5 interceptions. He's been pretty turnover prone. Not to say that that's a backbreaker, but fumbles, interceptions, just the youth of Shapen has shown so much more than I think we all expected. Everybody saw him in the Big 12 championship game, complete his first 17 passes and win. And you thought this guy is the future of Baylor quarterback. Then he wins the job over Gary Bohannon. You think, all right, well, he must be the second coming of an RG3 or a Bryce Petty because of how good he was to beat out a senior quarterback. And then this season, he has not reached the ceiling, but instead filled a role. Gary Bohannon led Baylor to a Big 12 championship because he filled a role, not an elite quarterback by any means. That's what Blake Shapen is right now. He's just a guy who's filling the role this team's asking him to do. They're not going to let him air it out. They're not going to unleash that car because they can't with so many youthful wide receivers and a youthful Shapen himself. So He's a year away. He might throw 3 interceptions against Oklahoma this weekend and gift the Sooners a win. And I wouldn't be shocked. Now, at the same time, we've seen the upside of 350 yards against Oklahoma State and a couple of touchdowns. He might do that too. It's a matter of which Blake Shapen do you get? Do you get the kid that is a gamer and steps up into a big time role, or do you get the Blake Shapen we've seen probably a little more prevalently, that's a young quarterback still trying to figure out how to play against Big 12 defenses that are much improved from what you saw even 5 years ago. So there's still a big question mark at Baylor's quarterback and at Baylor's wide receiver group. And really the one, maybe the two things, the offensive line and Richard Reese are your two mainstays. And then past that, it's all right, who can step up, fill a role, and help Baylor win any given football game they play in?
Defensively, for this football team. They've had some ups. They've certainly had some downs here in calendar year 2022. You think back, they're coming off a dominant performance out in Lubbock, where they just wreaked havoc on that Red Raider offense, 45-17, the final in that game. But then you rewind a few weeks prior, that loss in Morgantown was quite an eyesore. So how much confidence do you have in this unit and their capacity to have gotten things figured out by the time they come up to Norman on Saturday?
You know, Baylor's got a really good defense that some weeks is really good at being bad. The way I've explained this team in general is Baylor's a really good football team. You saw it in the preseason rankings. You see it with some senior-laden positions and a high ceiling, but they're a really good football team that was really good at losing there for a while, just finding a way to not make that last play late in the game. That's almost squarely on the defense. When they needed to stop, they couldn't get it. When the defense needed to step up big, even late in games, there just wasn't anything there. And you knew the opposing team's going to go and make a play. Now, Kansas, that changed. Granted, it is Kansas, a better team, but still, Baylor outmatched them. Much more physical, much more athletic, and that gave them the edge late in the game. West Virginia, the week prior, you saw a complete fall apart. So it's somewhere between those 2 weeks where something clicked for the Bears. And then you go into Texas Tech and you force them to throw 3 quarterbacks out there. You pick off each of the quarterbacks and force 5 interceptions in total. And you're seeing a different look Baylor defense. Now they look like they're playing as the unit we were all promised. I read an article from Sports Illustrated this week that said, this is the Baylor we were promised in the preseason. They're finally catching up to speed defensively. So do you get the West Virginia Baylor defense? And I think if JT Daniels can torch Baylor defense, then Dylan Gabriel certainly can too. Or do you see what Baylor was able to do last week? Put a lot of pressure on Baron Morton, and the defensive line can get some penetration that opens up opportunities for the secondary to make big plays. And it's not a good secondary by any means whatsoever, but it can be. It's shown flashes of that. And if they do what they did against Texas Tech, this is Baylor's game to win, because not only does the defense step up, the offense holds the ball for 40 minutes. And if that's the Baylor you see on Saturday, the Bears win in Norman by 10, but that's a very big if.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you kind of stole the question out from under my nose there. I was going to ask what the overall recipe looks like for a Baylor victory on Saturday, but obviously, as you mentioned, I think more than anything else, it's going to come down to time of possession, being able to control the pace and the flow of the game for this Baylor football team, and just letting Richard Reese cook. By the way, before we let you go, who's Baylor's next head coach after Dave Aranda takes the Nebraska job?
Yeah, you know, it's crazy. Aranda actually signed 3 offseason contracts. He's going to coach Nebraska, Auburn, and West Virginia simultaneously, all via Zoom. But, you know, post-COVID, the way that things work, it's a technological world, so he can do it. My bet is on Parker Thune. You know, we've been talking a lot about him to step up into a coaching role because of how well that he's filled a role at a radio station. And so I don't know if you could put in a good word to the guy, we'd love to have him in Waco.
Drake Toll of Locked On Baylor. Follow him on social media at Drake C. Toll. Drake, have an awesome time in Norman. This is your first trip up this week.
First trip to Norman. I've been to Stillwater, and I can only imagine it's better than Stillwater because it's just a field and a university.
It is better than Stillwater. I can promise you that.
I am more than excited to crash on your couch, and very excited because I hear it is an exquisite couch.
That it is. We'll see you this weekend, Drake. Thanks so much for the time.
Absolutely.